In the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, there are 111 handwritten volumes containing the private journal of Queen Victoria. Every word in them is in her daughter's handwriting. The originals are gone. For 29 years, beginning the year after her mother died, Princess Beatrice sat with a volume of the most famous diary in the world open in front of her, copied out the parts she judged fit to survive, and then destroyed the book. She was following written instructions that nobody else had ever read. When she finished, in 1931, 69 years of a queen's private thought had been reduced to about a third of its original length, and the only person who knew exactly what had gone into the fire was the shy, obedient youngest child who had spent her whole life being told she would never be allowed one of her own. If you like the stories that got quietly tidied out of the official record, subscribe. This channel goes looking for the parts somebody decided you were better off not seeing. Chapter 1. The Child Who Was Handed to a Widow. On the night Albert died, Victoria carried her sleeping 4-year-old into her own bed and did not let go. The child was Princess Beatrice Mary Victoria Theodore, born at 1:45 in the afternoon on the 14th of April, 1857, at Buckingham Palace. She was the 5th daughter and the 9th and last child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Her arrival was unusual for its time. Victoria took chloroform for the birth, administered by Dr. John Snow, and both the Church of England and a good part of the medical profession disapproved. Pain in childbirth was held to be a woman's proper portion. Victoria had no patience with that idea. She called it that blessed chloroform, and she went on calling it that for the rest of her life. A fortnight after the birth, she wrote that she was amply rewarded and forgot all she had gone through when she heard dearest Albert say, "It is a fine child and a girl." The names were an inventory of the family's affections: Mary for Princess Mary, Duchess of Gloucester; Victoria for the Queen herself; Theodore for Theodora, Princess of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, the half-sister of Victoria's own girlhood. She was christened on the 16th of June, 1857, in the private chapel at Buckingham Palace, in front of the small crowd of relations that such occasions required. But nobody in the family used any of those names. They called her Baby. They called her Baby when she was an infant. They called her Baby when she was a young woman. Victoria was still writing the word about her when Beatrice was a married mother of 4, with grey coming into her hair. It sounds like affection, and it began as affection. Albert wrote that Baby practiced her scales like a good prima donna before a performance, and that she had a good voice. He told Baron Stockmar she was the most amusing baby we have had. Victoria described her as a pretty, plump and flourishing child, with fine, large blue eyes, a pretty little mouth, and very fine skin. For 4 years and 8 months, she was the last happy accident of a happy marriage. She had 8 older brothers and sisters, a father who taught his children economics by buying vegetables from them at market rates, and a mother who was, at that point in her life, a busy and largely contented woman. Then came the 14th of December, 1861. Prince Albert died at Windsor of what his doctors called typhoid fever. He was 42. What happened in the house that night has been written about 1,000 times, but one detail belongs to this story and to no other. Victoria went and fetched her sleeping youngest child out of the nursery, carried her into her own bed, and lay there awake through the small hours holding her, with the child wrapped in the nightclothes of a man who would never wear them again. That is where the rest of Beatrice's life was decided. Not in a will, not in a settlement, not in any document anyone signed. In a bed, in the dark, in the worst night of her mother's existence. Victoria did not recover in the way the country expected her to. She withdrew from public life, from her ministers, and from most of her own family. The people she still tolerated were her daughter Alice and the small girl who had been in the bed. Alice married and went to Hesse. The other sisters married and went to Prussia, to Denmark, to Argyll. One by one, the household emptied of daughters until, by 1871, only the youngest was left. She was 14 years old. There is a phrase for what she became, though nobody in the household would have used it. She became the arrangement. She was the person who was always there, always available, always in the next room. She was writing letters on her mother's behalf before she was 16. When Victoria fell seriously ill in 1871, Beatrice took the journal entries down at dictation, and that is worth marking carefully, because it is the first moment the daughter's hand entered the mother's diary. It would not be the last. In 1876, she was allowed to sort through the sheet music that Albert and Victoria had never used, which tells you something about the quality of the work she was given, and about how carefully her mother kept her close to the relics. It would be wrong to picture a dull girl in all this. Beatrice was documented as the shyest of all Victoria's children, and she was also, in private, the most accomplished of them in a quiet way. She acted well. She danced well. She played the piano properly and composed a little. She took up photography seriously enough that her mother had a dark room put in for her at Osborne, which was an unusual and expensive indulgence for a young woman of that period. She was drawn to theology and stayed drawn to it for the rest of her life. At the age of 84, she would publish a translation of a German diary kept by her mother's grandmother, corresponding with her publisher about it like any other author. She had a mind. She simply had nowhere to put it except into her mother's correspondence. There was one more member of that shrunken household worth naming here, because he matters later. John Brown, the Highland servant, was the person Victoria leaned on most heavily after Albert's death, and the rest of the family could not stand him. When Brown died in 1883, Victoria collapsed into grief again and turned, again, to Beatrice. And Beatrice, alone among the 9 children, had never disliked him. Hold on to that, because in 20 years' time, the person deciding what survived of Queen Victoria's written record of John Brown would be the only one of her children who had no grudge against the man. Victoria was open about what she wanted. She said of her youngest that she is my constant companion, and hope and trust will never leave me while I live. And the strangest part of the whole story is that Beatrice had said it first. At the age of 6, she announced to the family that she did not like weddings at all, that she should never be married, and that she should stay with her mother. Every family has a story like that about a small child. Most families repeat it fondly for a few years and then let it go. This family wrote it down and treated it as a contract. And there was one more thing in that household that only ever passed between the two of them. The journal the Queen had been keeping since she was 13 was kept locked away in a box, and in time the only person besides Victoria with continuous access to it was the girl who had been carried into the bed. Chapter 2. The house that was bought with private money. Osborne was not a palace of the state, and that single fact would decide what happened to everything inside it. The Isle of Wight lies off the Hampshire coast, close enough to be convenient and far enough to be private. And in the 1840s, Victoria and Albert went looking there for somewhere that belonged to them rather than to the country. The Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, recommended a place called Osborne, then owned by Lady Isabella Blackford. They took it on a lease in 1843, liked it, and bought the estate outright in May 1845 for £28,000. The money is the important part. It did not come from Parliament. It came from the Privy Purse, which is to say it came from savings, And those savings existed because Albert had spent years dragging a spectacularly wasteful royal household into order. Osborne was bought with the couple's own money. That made it private property in the fullest legal sense, and it meant that the family could do whatever it liked with the place and everything in it, without asking anybody, forever. Keep that thought. It comes back. Albert did not want to alter the house that stood there. Thomas Cubitt, the London master builder who had put up much of Belgravia and who would later build the front of Buckingham Palace, advised pulling it down and starting again. So they did. Albert designed the new house himself, working with Cubitt, and he deliberately went round the government's commissioners of woods and forests, the officials who would normally have controlled any royal building project. He did that for one reason. If they were not involved, they could not overrule him. The style he chose was Italianate, an Italian Renaissance palazzo dropped onto a green English headland because the light coming off the Solent reminded him of the Bay of Naples. 2 Belvedere towers rose above the roofline. The walls were brick and ironwork, cemented over to imitate Bath stone, which was a characteristically thrifty Cubitt trick, and he was ahead of most of his trade in fireproofing and insulation. He brought his own doors and fireplaces and plaster patterns down from his London workshops. It went up in stages across a generation. The pavilion, holding the private royal apartments and the nurseries, was finished in 1846. The household wing, built for the officials and ladies who travelled with the Queen, was finished in 1848. The old house came down that same year, and the main wing rose on its footprint by 1851, joined to the household side by a long corridor. Here is what that plan actually means. 3 ranks of human being, 3 separate sets of walls, 1 house, the family in the pavilion, the household in the middle, the servants below and behind. A person's whole life could be read off the floor they slept on. The service side of Osborne was built and rebuilt for 40 years, and the dates tell their own story. The old stable block from the previous house was kept on, probably to save money, then enlarged with a carriage house, then converted again into kitchen offices and a servants' hall. Visitors today walk in through what was the household entrance, into what was the 19th century servants' dining room. A dormitory for the male servants went up with the original works in the 1840s. In 1866, a smoking room was built near the household wing for the gentlemen. In 1880, a private chapel was added to Victoria's own rooms. In 1887, the men's dormitory was extended specifically to house the Indian servants who had joined the household that year. And in 1894, a dormitory for housemaids was put up, and the reason recorded for it is the extra staff needed by Princess Beatrice's young family once the new wing was finished. That is what a great house is underneath the terraces. A building that keeps adding rooms for the people who are not supposed to be seen in it. The grounds were the part the children remembered. There was a private beach on Osborne Bay with a bathing machine so elaborate it had a veranda, curtains, a changing room, and a plumbed water closet. There were Italianate terraces with parterres and statuary, and walkways of coloured imitation lava. There was a miniature fort with earthwork redoubts, built as a teaching toy. In 1859, Albert designed a new stable block for 50 horses, and Cubitt's firm put it up on the old cricket pitch by 1860. And there was the Swiss cottage. It was built between 1853 and 1854, imported in pieces and reassembled nearly a mile east of the main house, with a real working kitchen where the royal children learned to cook. Each child had a garden plot. They grew vegetables and sold them to their father at a fair price, and he paid them, and that was the lesson. A museum went up beside it in 1862 to hold the things they collected. Beatrice was a small child when that museum was built, and her father was already dead. Consider what the estate was by then. More than 2,000 acres by 1864, with 21 miles of new walks and drives cut inside the park. The original purchase was around 342 acres, and the neighbouring Barton Manor, 500 acres bought from Winchester College, ran as the home farm. £28,000 for the land in 1845, 50 horses in the stables, roughly 15 staff on site all year, rising to about 70 when the family was in residence. The English heritage estate on the same ground today is 354 acres. In 1890, they began building again. The Durbar wing went up between 1890 and 1892 because Osborne had no grand reception room at all, and large parties had previously been held in marquees on the lawn in summer. The Durbar room downstairs was designed by John Lockwood Kipling, director of the Mayo School of Art in Lahore and father of Rudyard Kipling, with the plasterwork executed on site by his former student Bhai Ram Singh, a Sikh architect and master craftsman working from moulds made under his supervision in India. There is a peacock over the chimney-piece and a carpet from Agra. It filled up with the tribute of an empire at its jubilees. The first floor of that new wing was built as a private suite for Princess Beatrice and her family. She was in her middle 30s by then, and married, and had children of her own. And the accommodation for her separate life was an extension bolted onto the side of her mother's house. Chapter 3. The Queen Who Could Not Stop Writing. She began the diary at 13, and her mother read every page of it, every single day. On the 1st of August, 1832, a girl who was not yet queen opened a new book and wrote the first line in it. "This book, Mama gave me, that I might write the journal of my journey to Wales in it." The book was a gift from her mother, the Duchess of Kent. The habit itself came from her governess, Baroness Leetzen, who taught her that a young lady kept a journal, and from the first page to the day she became queen, her mother inspected it. Every day. That is the fact this whole story turns on, and it arrives on page 1. Victoria's private diary was never private. It was read by somebody else from the beginning, and she wrote it knowing that. Then, in 1837, she became queen, and the inspections stopped. What poured out after that is difficult to hold in the mind. She wrote every day. She wrote when she was in love, when she was in labour, when she was furious with her ministers, when she was grieving, when she was bored. She wrote about her body. She wrote about her children with a bluntness that would have appalled them. She wrote about her servants as people rather than as furniture. And she did not stop for 69 years. The last entry is dated the 13th of January 1901, 10 days before her death. The scale is the scale of an industry. The standard estimate is that she produced between 2,000 and 2,500 words a day across her adult life, and something close to 60 million words in total across her journals and her letters. The biographer Giles St. Aubyn worked out in 1972 that this was the equivalent of writing a novel every month, or around 700 volumes across a lifetime. The journals alone ran to something like 122 volumes, though the counting varies depending on what is included. Nobody in British history had ever recorded themselves like this. Nobody has since. She was not writing in secret either. Extracts were published while she lived. Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands came out in 1868, and the first edition sold 20,000 copies, which was an enormous success. There was a sequel. More extracts appeared in Theodore Martin's Official Life of Prince Albert, published across 5 volumes between 1875 and 1880. So the Queen knew perfectly well what her journal was worth, and she knew the public appetite for it. And she went on writing at the same reckless velocity anyway. That is the contradiction at the centre of Victoria. She was a woman who wanted to be known completely and was terrified of it, and the contradiction had been trained into her. Think again about those first 5 years of the diary, with the Duchess of Kent reading every page before bed. A girl learns very quickly, under that arrangement, to write two things at once. She writes what happened, and she writes it in a form that will survive her mother's eyes. Some part of Victoria never stopped doing both, which is why the journal can be startlingly frank on one page and oddly guarded on the next. There is another thing the Daily Inspection did. It established, when she was 13 years old, that this diary was a document other people were entitled to handle. Not a secret, a family object. That principle was set down in 1832, and it was never revoked. And 69 years later, it would be the principle that let a daughter open the books and start cutting. And the habit held through everything. She kept it up on tour, in mourning, and in the middle of political crises, for 69 years, in a family that lost her husband, married off 9 children, and acquired an empire in the meantime. It is the record of somebody who could not let a day pass until it had been put somewhere. The evidence for the terror is in what she did with the books when she was finished with them. They went into the box. The box was locked. The box travelled with her, and the number of people permitted to open it never rose above 2. By the 1880s, the journal had become a considerable physical object. It was decades of volumes. It was, in the plainest sense, the most valuable single record in the country, more revealing than any state paper, because it was the unguarded running commentary of the head of the British Empire on every person and event that had crossed her path since she was a girl at Kensington. And by the 1880s, the person who carried it, sorted it, and increasingly wrote in it was her youngest daughter. Look at how that happened. Because it happened by degrees, and nobody ever announced it. Beatrice took over the correspondence duties from her sisters Alice, Helena, and Louise as each of them married away. She wrote letters in her mother's name. She managed the flow of paper. During Victoria's illness in 1871, she wrote the journal at dictation. By the last years of the reign, she was, in everything but title, the private secretary of the sovereign, and she was the only person with continuous access to the whole record. There was never an appointment. There was never a salary. There was a woman in her 40s, in her mother's house, holding the keys. The journal in the box was the greatest record of a single life in the English language. It had survived a childhood of surveillance, a marriage, 9 children, a widowhood of 40 years, and the entire second half of the 19th century. It had about 30 years left. Chapter 4. Every suitor was quietly removed. The newspapers announced her engagement twice, and both times the man was gone before the ink was dry. Victoria's position on the subject of her youngest daughter marrying was not a policy she debated. It was a fact of nature, like weather. Beatrice would not marry. Beatrice would not leave. The matter was not open, and for years it was not even mentioned aloud in her presence. The trouble was that Beatrice was a young woman of considerable charm in the most watched family in Europe, and men kept noticing. The first was Louis Napoleon, the Prince Imperial, son of the exiled Napoleon III. After his father's death in 1873, the newspapers reported that an engagement between him and Beatrice was imminent. It was the sort of match that made obvious sense to everybody outside the household. He was young, he was in England, he was royal, and he was in want of a future. He was killed in the Anglo-Zulu War on the 1st of June, 1879. Victoria's own journal recorded the morning the news reached them. Dear Beatrice, crying very much as I did too, gave me the telegram. It was dawning, and little sleep did I get. Beatrice is so distressed. Everyone quite stunned. Read that again, and notice who is holding the paper. The daughter brought the telegram to the mother. The daughter was crying. And the mother, writing it up afterwards, put her own tears into the sentence first. There is a whole life folded inside that entry. Beatrice was 22. A young man she had been publicly linked to for 6 years had been speared to death in a skirmish in southern Africa, and the record of her grief exists only as a clause in her mother's account of her own bad night. That is how nearly everything about Beatrice reaches the present. Sideways, in somebody else's sentence, as a detail in the story of a more important person. The second attempt came from her eldest brother. The Prince of Wales proposed marrying Beatrice to Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, who was the widower of her dead sister Alice. It sounds grotesque to a modern ear, and it was entirely practical by the standards of the time. Louis was a known quantity. The children needed a mother, and the arrangement would have kept Beatrice mostly in England. There was one obstacle. It was illegal. British law forbade a man to marry his deceased wife's sister, and by extension, the match was barred. The Prince of Wales actually backed the deceased wife's sister bill in Parliament to clear the way. It passed the Commons. The Lords threw it out, so the law of England blocked that one, and the Queen did not have to lift a finger. The third is the one that gives the whole pattern away, because in that case she did have to. Prince Louis of Battenberg was an officer of the Royal Navy, a serious and capable man, and he took an interest in Beatrice. Victoria's response was not a letter, not a word to an equerry, not a quiet suggestion through a lady in waiting. At dinner, she physically seated herself between the two of them. Then she instructed her daughter to ignore him. Beatrice did as she was told. Louis, who had no idea what he had done wrong, drew the obvious conclusion that he was not wanted, and in April 1884 he married Beatrice's niece, Princess Victoria of Hesse, instead. There is a fourth name that hovers at the edge of this. Prince Alexander of Battenberg, called Sandro, never made a formal approach, but wrote later that he might even at one time have become engaged to the friend of my childhood, Beatrice of England. Might even, at one time. That is the sound a possibility makes as it goes past without stopping. Now put the pattern together. Between 1873 and 1884, 4 men of suitable rank came within reach of Princess Beatrice. One died in Africa. One was blocked by the House of Lords. One was seen off at a dinner table. One thought about it and drifted away. And at the end of it, the daughter was 27, unmarried, and living exactly where she had been living at 17. The question worth asking is what Victoria thought she was doing. The kindest reading is grief. She had lost her husband at 42 and had spent 2 decades organising her existence around not being alone in a room. The child in the bed had become the guarantee against that, and every suitor was a threat to the guarantee. There is real pain underneath the behaviour, and it should not be waved away. The colder reading sits alongside it and does not cancel it out. Victoria had married. Victoria had known what a marriage was. She had written about it in that journal, in detail, at length, with a physical frankness that would later cause a great deal of trouble. She knew exactly what she was denying her daughter, because she had had it, and she had loved it, and the man had died. Whatever else the arrangement was, it was not made in ignorance. And there is a third reading which is neither kind nor cruel, but simply administrative, and it may be the truest of the 3. By the 1870s, Beatrice had become load-bearing. She was the person who handled the correspondence of a sovereign who would not see her ministers in person, who managed the paper, who knew where things were and what had already been answered. Marriages take daughters to Darmstadt and Copenhagen and Argyll. This one could not be allowed to go anywhere, because the machine had been built around her and there was no replacement. The Queen of England did not want a son-in-law. She wanted her secretary to stay at her desk. And Beatrice, through all of it, did not fight. Not once, in 11 years. She wrote the letters and sorted the papers and sat where she was put at dinner and went where the household went, from Windsor to Balmoral to Osborne, on a calendar she did not set. Nobody recorded what she felt about any of it, and that absence is itself part of the story. There is no cache of anguished letters from Princess Beatrice. There is no diary of her own in which she sets down what it was like to watch 4 possibilities arrive and leave. She was a woman surrounded by compulsive writers, in a family that produced paper the way other families produce noise, and she left almost nothing behind about her own interior life. She was, by then, 27 years old. Most of the women she had grown up with were running households in Germany with children old enough to ride. She had a bedroom in her mother's house and a desk in her mother's sitting room, and the only correspondence she conducted in her own name was on somebody else's behalf. Then, at the wedding of the niece who had got Prince Louis, she met his younger brother. Chapter 5. 7 months without a single word. She told her mother she wished to marry, and her mother stopped speaking to her for the better part of a year. The wedding was at Darmstadt in April 1884. Beatrice's niece, Princess Victoria of Hesse, was marrying Prince Louis of Battenberg, and the whole extended family assembled to watch it. Among the groom's party was his younger brother, Prince Henry of Battenberg, born in Milan in 1858, known in the family as Lico. He was 25, she was 27. The Battenbergs were royal, but only just. The line came from the marriage of Prince Alexander of Hesse to Countess Julia von Hauke, which was morganatic, meaning the wife's rank was too low to pass to the children in full. In Germany, the Battenberg brothers were serene highnesses, and everybody knew what that meant. They were the poor relations with good manners and better looks. Henry had a Prussian commission and no fortune to speak of. Beatrice came home from Darmstadt and told her mother that she intended to marry him. There was no row. Victoria did not shout or forbid it, or write a furious letter. She did something quieter and far more effective. She stopped speaking to her daughter. For roughly 7 months, from about May to November 1884, the Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India did not address a single spoken word to the child who had been her constant companion for 23 years. They were in the same houses. They took the same meals. They travelled together on the same trains to the same residences. And everything that passed between them passed on paper, handed across a table, or carried by a servant from one room to another. Try to sit inside that for a moment. Not the drama of it, the ordinariness. 7 months of breakfasts. 7 months of carriage rides. 7 months of a woman writing out a note to ask her own daughter to pass something, and the daughter writing back. A royal residence in the 1880s was not a private home, in any sense a modern person would recognise. There were footmen at the doors and dressers in the bedrooms and pages in the corridors, and a household of that size keeps no secrets from itself. The silence was not something 2 women could have conducted in private even if they had wanted to. And here is the detail that makes it unbearable. Beatrice's job in that household was secretary. Her entire function was correspondence. So for 7 months, she went on doing the work, writing her mother's letters for her, managing her mother's papers, sitting at her mother's desk in her mother's service, while her mother would not say good morning to her. She wrote to prime ministers in the morning in her mother's voice. In the afternoon, she wrote to her mother in her own, and got a note back. The reason underneath the silence was not political, and it was not about rank. Henry was acceptable enough, on paper, in the end. The reason was that Victoria regarded Beatrice as baby, and baby was the innocent one, and marriage meant a husband, and a husband meant the physical facts of a marriage bed, and the Queen, who had written so freely about her own, could not bear that her last child should have the same. There is a bleak symmetry in that which nobody at the time could have seen. The very frankness that made Victoria unable to tolerate the thought of her daughter's marriage was the frankness that would one day have to be scrubbed out of the journals. The mother could not bear her daughter to have that life. 47 years later, the daughter would sit down and remove her mother's record of having had it. It took the rest of the family to break the silence, and it took months. The Princess of Wales and the Crown Princess of Prussia worked on their mother together. Their argument was not about Beatrice's happiness. They knew better than to try that. Their argument was about Albert. They reminded Victoria how much joy this child had brought her father and what he would have wanted for her, and that was the lever that finally moved. The Prince of Wales and the Grand Duke Louis of Hesse pressed the same case from the side. It is worth noticing who had to do the persuading. Not Beatrice. She never made the case for her own marriage. Her sisters and her brother made it for her over half a year, while she sat in the same rooms and said nothing and did the filing. Victoria relented. Formal consent was granted at a meeting of the Privy Council on the 27th of January, 1885. But consent came with terms, and the terms tell you exactly how much had actually changed. Prince Henry of Battenberg was required to resign his commission in the Prussian army. He was required to give up his country and any career he might have had in it. He and Beatrice were required to make their permanent home with the Queen in her houses on her calendar. And Beatrice was required to carry on as her mother's unofficial secretary precisely as before, as though the wedding were a change of surname and nothing more. There is a word for a marriage granted on those conditions, and the word is not freedom. Look at what each party actually surrendered. Henry gave up an army, a country, and a future. Beatrice gave up nothing, because she had nothing to give, and gained a husband on the condition that her working day stayed exactly as it was. And Victoria gave up the sound of silence at the dinner table, which had cost her 7 months to maintain, and got back a secretary who now came with a manservant of her own attached. The Queen had lost an argument and won the settlement. Yet something had shifted, and it is worth being fair to Beatrice about what she had just done. She had gone up against the immovable fact of her family, and, after 7 months of a punishment that would have broken most people, she had won a version of what she asked for. She had never argued, never made a scene, never threatened anything. She had simply declined to change her mind while her mother stopped speaking to her. That is the first appearance in this story of something the viewer should keep hold of. Underneath the shyness, there was a will made of iron, and it did not bend, and it did not announce itself. 20 years later, that same will would sit down in front of the most important documents in the country, and it would not bend then either. Chapter 6. A wedding with conditions attached. She was allowed her husband on the understanding that he would move into her mother's house and never leave it. They were married on the 23rd of July, 1885, at St. Mildred's Church, Whippingham, on the Isle of Wight. Notice the address. Not Westminster Abbey, where her mother had been crowned. Not St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where the family married and was buried. A parish church near Osborne, a mile or so from the front door, small enough that the guest list had to be cut. The wedding of a daughter of the Queen Empress was held, in effect, at the end of the drive. She wore white satin trimmed with orange blossom, and a lace overskirt caught up with bouquets of orange blossom entwined with white heather. Beatrice knew lace. She collected it and studied it, and the dress reflected somebody who cared about the detail rather than the spectacle. On her head was a diamond circlet, and over that she wore her mother's veil. The Honiton lace veil that Victoria had worn at her own wedding in 1840 was lent to exactly one of her 5 daughters, and it was this one. It is an extraordinary gesture, and it can be read 2 ways at once, which is true of almost everything Victoria did to this child. It was the highest compliment in the family's possession. It was also, quite literally, her mother's wedding placed over her face. The Queen walked her down the aisle alongside her eldest brother, the Prince of Wales. There were 10 bridesmaids, and every single one of them was a niece. Louise, Victoria, and Maud of Wales, Irene and Alex of Hesse, Marie, Victoria Melita, and Alexandra of Edinburgh, Helena Victoria, and Marie-Louise of Schleswig-Holstein. Henry's supporters were his brothers, Prince Alexander of Bulgaria and Prince Francis Joseph of Battenberg. Some people did not come. The Crown Prince and Princess of Prussia were detained in Germany, which was a genuine loss given how hard the Crown Princess had worked to make the day happen at all. William Ewart Gladstone did not attend. The Duchess of Teck was in mourning. Sir Moses Montefiore sent a silver tea service. It was engraved with a line from the Book of Proverbs. Many daughters have acted virtuously, but thou excellest them all. That is a wedding present with an opinion in it. And it was not the only one. A few days before the ceremony, the Times printed a passage addressed directly to the bride. The devotion of your Royal Highness to our beloved sovereign has won our warmest admiration and our deepest gratitude. May those blessings which it has hitherto been your constant aim to confer on others now be returned in full measure to yourself. Read the surface, and it is a compliment. Read it again, and it is something else entirely. The most respectable newspaper in the country was telling a princess, in print, that she had spent her life giving to somebody else and might now be permitted a little of it back. Everyone could see the arrangement. It was discussed in the leader columns of a national paper. And nobody, in the end, did anything about it except word it politely. The terms of the settlement were carried out to the letter. On the day before the wedding, a naturalisation bill went through the House of Lords, making Henry a British subject. He was made a Knight Companion of the Garter, and Victoria granted him the style of Royal Highness within the United Kingdom, purely so that his rank would not sit below his wife's at her own table. In Germany, he remained a Serene Highness, because the Battenberg line came from that morganatic marriage, and no British grant could alter it. So here is what Prince Henry of Battenberg was on his wedding day. A man who had surrendered his commission, his country and his career, and had received in exchange a British passport, a ribbon, and a title that only worked in one kingdom, all of it handed to him personally by his mother-in-law. Everything he now had came from her. They left for their honeymoon at Quar Abbey House, about 6 miles away. Victoria, in her own account to the Crown Princess, bore up bravely till the departure, and then fairly gave way. The honeymoon lasted 2 days. Then the couple came back to Osborne, and Beatrice picked up her mother's correspondence, and the household resumed its ordinary shape with one extra person in it. The children came quickly. Alexander, called Drino, in 1886. Victoria Eugenie, called Ina, in 1887. Leopold in 1889. Maurice in 1891. There had been a miscarriage earlier in the marriage. 4 children in 5 years, born into her mother's houses, on her mother's floors. Every one of those 4 names carries a fate that has not happened yet, and it is worth setting them down now, so that the weight of the later chapters lands properly. Drino would end his life as a marquess. Ina would marry a king of Spain, and when their heir proved to be haemophiliac, her husband would blame not her, but her mother, and never forgive Beatrice for it. Leopold would inherit that same disease himself and die after an emergency operation before he was 33. Maurice would be killed in Flanders at 23. At the christenings, none of that existed. There were 4 healthy children in a house on an island, and their grandmother was the most powerful woman on earth, and their father had married into a family that had swallowed him whole and could at least be relied upon to keep them. And even in the pregnancies, the older woman's grip is visible. During Beatrice's first, Victoria criticised her for eating alone in her room rather than coming down to dinner. She had urged the princess, she wrote, to continue coming to dinner and not simply mope in her own room, which was very bad for her. And then she added the line that says everything. In my case, I regularly came to dinner up to the very last day. I did it. So can you. Beatrice gave birth the following week, with chloroform, as her mother had. For a few years after that, it very nearly worked. The Durbar wing went up between 1890 and 1892, and the whole first floor of it was hers. She had a husband, 4 children, her own rooms, a household inside the household. Downstairs, the Durbar room filled with the tribute of the Jubilees, silver and copper vases, Indian armour, a model of a palace, a carpet from Agra, a peacock over the fire. Between 1892 and 1896, Princess Beatrice had something close to a whole life. She was in her middle 30s. She had 4 children under 7, a set of rooms with her name attached, an office of real work, and a mother who by then depended on her absolutely and had stopped pretending otherwise. If the story ended there, it would be a modest, happy ending, arrived at late and by a difficult road. Her husband, meanwhile, was going quietly out of his mind. Chapter 7. The husband who begged to be sent away. He went to a war in West Africa because it was the only door out of that house that his mother-in-law would open. The difficulty with Prince Henry of Battenberg was that he had nothing whatever to do. He had been a soldier. That had been taken away as a condition of the marriage. He was not British by birth and had no seat, no estate, no regiment of his own, and no function in the machinery of the court. His wife had a job, an important one, and she did it all day. His mother-in-law had an empire, and Henry had a suite of rooms in somebody else's house and a great many hours to fill. Victoria did try. In 1889, she made him governor of the Isle of Wight, which came with Carisbrooke Castle attached and a certain amount of ceremony. He was promoted colonel in 1893 and made a privy councillor on the 20th of November, 1894. These were real honours, and they were also, transparently, occupations invented for a man who needed one. The governorship is the clearest example. The office of Governor of the Isle of Wight was an ancient one, attached to Carisbrooke Castle in the middle of the island, a Norman fortress on an older Saxon earthwork that had been crown property since the 13th century. By the 1880s, it was a ceremonial post with a ruined castle attached and very little to govern. The gatehouse had lost its roof and its floors. One of the ranges was a shell. The place drew tourists, and it housed the island's artillery militia, and that was about the extent of it. That was the employment found for a professional soldier in his early 30s, custodian of a ruin, on a small island in the household of his wife's mother. They did not hold him. There is one further shadow across this marriage, and it comes from a single biographical source, so it has to be handled as a claim rather than as a settled fact. Beatrice's sister Louise is reported to have told the royal physician Sir James Reed of what she described as Prince Henry's attempted relations with her, which she had declined. That is one biographer's account of one conversation, recorded years after the event, and no other evidence supports or contradicts it. It is set down here because it exists in the literature, and left where it stands. There was an episode at the carnival at Ajaccio in Corsica, where the sources record him keeping what they call low company. Beatrice's response was to send a Royal Navy officer to remove her husband from temptation. On another occasion, he slipped away to Corsica with his brother, and Victoria sent a warship after him. A warship to fetch a grown man home from a holiday. The picture is comic until it is looked at squarely, and then it is not comic at all. A man with a decent military record was being retrieved from the Mediterranean like a boy caught out after curfew by a family that had bought his obedience with a ribbon and a title. In November 1895, the 4th Anglo-Ashanti expedition was being assembled for West Africa, and Henry went to the Queen and asked to be allowed to join it as military secretary to the Commander-in-Chief, Colonel Sir Francis Scott. Victoria did not want him to go. Her misgivings are documented, and, given the outcome, they were correct. The danger on that coast was not principally the fighting. It was the fever, and the fever took men who never saw an enemy at all. He asked anyway, and he kept asking, and eventually, she gave way. Think about what that request actually was. He had to beg an old woman for permission to go to a malarial coast on the far side of the world in order to have something to do. And he begged, and she said yes, and he went. Henry and Beatrice parted on the 6th of December, 1895. They never saw one another again. He landed in West Africa on Christmas Day. The expedition moved inland, and at Prasu, roughly 30 miles from Kumasi, he contracted malaria. By the 10th of January 1896, he was gravely ill, and the decision was taken to send him home. He was carried down to the coast and put aboard the Royal Navy cruiser Blonde. He died aboard her on the 20th of January 1896, off the coast of Sierra Leone. He was 37 years old. Beatrice was waiting for him at Madeira in the Atlantic, positioned there to meet the ship and bring her husband home. She was still waiting on the 22nd of January when the telegram reached her and told her that he had been dead for 2 days. Hold that date. The 22nd of January. It is going to come back in 5 years and 2 days, in another house, with another death. And the coincidence is the kind of thing a novelist would be told to cut for being too neat. His body was brought north by the cruiser Blenheim from the Canary Islands. The funeral was held on the 5th of February 1896 at St Mildred's Church, Whippingham, the same small parish church where they had been married 10 years and 6 months before. He was laid in what became the Battenberg Chapel. Victoria wrote in her journal that she went over to Beatrice's room and sat a while with her, and that she is so piteous in her misery. That sentence is the whole relationship in 11 words. The mother goes to the daughter's room. She sits a while, and then she writes it down. Later that year, Victoria put up a Celtic cross to Henry near Conishat Cottage at Balmoral, with an inscription that began, "Brief life, in sport, and war so keen." Beatrice was 38. She had been married for 10 years and 6 months. She took a month of mourning, and then she went back to her desk. There is no record of anybody suggesting she do anything else. She had 4 children between 4 and 9 years old, no house of her own, no income independent of her mother, and a job she had held since she was 15. The household had a gap in the correspondence, and she filled it, because that is what she had always done, and because there was nowhere else to be. The gesture she chose for her husband tells you what she had left to give. 2 years after his death, a memorial committee gathered to decide how the island should remember him. A lifeboat was considered. Church windows were considered. What Beatrice supported instead was the restoration of the ruined gatehouse at Carisbrooke Castle to hold a museum, and on the 11th of August, 1898, she opened it. It is believed to be the only public museum in the United Kingdom founded by a member of the royal family. It filled up mostly with material about the imprisonment of a king in that castle 2.5 centuries earlier. A widow with no property of her own built her husband a memorial out of somebody else's ruin and stocked it with somebody else's history. It was, for the moment, the only thing in the world that was hers. Victoria gave her the governorship of the Isle of Wight that her husband had vacated in 1896, and Beatrice took it. It was the first office she had ever held in her own name. She had 5 years left with her mother. In those 5 years, she carried the correspondence, ran the household paperwork, and kept the key to a locked box that travelled between 3 houses. Nobody else could open it. Nobody else was ever going to be asked to. Chapter 8. The instruction nobody else ever read. Victoria died at 6:30 on a January evening and left her youngest child a private paper and an impossible job. The date was the 22nd of January 1901. The place was her bedroom on the first floor of the pavilion at Osborne. She was 81 years old. Through January she was reported weak and unwell, and then drowsy, and her physician Sir James Reed described her as dazed and confused. At her request, her Pomeranian, Turi, was laid on the bed. Her eldest son, who was about to become king, was in the room. So was her grandson, the German emperor. Somewhere in that house was the daughter who had been in the room for everything else, for 43 years. 5 years and 2 days earlier, a telegram had reached Beatrice at Madeira, telling her that her husband was dead. The funeral arrangements ran according to instructions Victoria had left herself, because she had thought about this carefully and written it down. There was to be no public lying in state. She was a soldier's daughter and wanted a military funeral. She was to be dressed in white rather than mourning black, and she was to wear her wedding veil. On the 25th of January, her sons and her grandson lifted her into the coffin. Certain things went in with her: a dressing gown of Albert's, a plaster cast of Albert's hand, and, arranged under a covering of flowers so that the family would not see them, a photograph of John Brown placed in her left hand and a lock of his hair, and on her right hand the wedding ring that had belonged to Brown's mother, which he had given her in 1883. That was done on her own prior instruction to Sir James Reed, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is the clearest surviving proof of how this woman's mind worked. She wanted the truth of her attachments buried with her, physically, in the coffin, and she wanted it hidden under flowers so that nobody would have to look at it, preserve it, conceal it, both at once. That was the instruction she gave about her own body, and it was the instruction she had already given about her diary. The funeral itself became one of the largest gatherings of European royalty ever assembled, and almost all of it was arranged around her wishes. On the 1st of February, the cortege left Osborne and went down to the water. Her coffin crossed the Solent aboard the royal yacht Alberta, with a line of yachts following and the assembled fleet firing minute guns as she passed. She lay aboard overnight. On the 2nd of February, the state funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, and on the 4th, she was buried beside Albert at the mausoleum at Frogmore. One detail from that day passed into permanent tradition. At Windsor Station, the horses drawing the gun carriage became unmanageable in the cold, and sailors from a nearby ship took the harness and a length of cord and hauled the carriage themselves. Every British state funeral since has had naval ratings pulling the gun carriage, because a team of horses panicked on a January morning in 1901. Beatrice wrote about the loss in March to the principal of the University of Glasgow. "You may imagine what the grief is," she wrote. "I, who had hardly ever been separated from my dear mother, can hardly realize what life will be like without her. Who was the center of everything? The center of everything. That is a description of a mother, and it is also a description of a job. And for this woman, there had never been a distinction between the two. Because there was another set of written instructions, and this one went to Beatrice. Victoria had left directions that her youngest daughter should take charge of the journals, go through them, and remove anything liable to affect any of the family painfully. Look closely at that arrangement, because there are two extraordinary things in it. The first is that Beatrice was not named literary executor in the will. This was not a formal appointment made in a legal document that lawyers had drafted and witnesses had signed. When she began the work, she described her authority in her own words. She had, she said, my dear mother's written instructions. A private paper, held by the person acting on it. Never published, never quoted in full, never seen by a court or a minister or a historian. The single largest act of documentary destruction in modern British royal history rested on a piece of paper that exactly one person had read. The second extraordinary thing is the choice itself. Victoria had 9 children and dozens of grandchildren. She had a new king in the family and a professional archive about to be established at Windsor. She could have left the journals sealed for 50 years, which was a perfectly normal arrangement for private papers of that importance. She could have handed them to an archivist. She could have split the task between her daughters. She gave the whole of it, alone, to the one child she had spent 40 years making certain would never have a life of her own, and she gave that child absolute discretion. Not a list of passages to remove, not a rule, a judgment, anything liable to affect any of the family painfully, as determined by Beatrice, in private, with no oversight and no appeal. There is a reading of that decision, which is simply love. Victoria trusted her. Of all of them, Beatrice was the one who had never wanted anything for herself, never leaked, never gossiped, never played the family off against each other. If a person wanted their secrets kept, she was the obvious choice in Europe. There is a colder reading, and it does not cancel the first. Beatrice was the only one of them who could be relied upon to obey. The others had opinions. The others had households of their own, and interests, and thrones. Beatrice had spent her entire adult life doing exactly as she was told by this woman, and the woman knew it, because she had built her that way. Whichever reading is preferred, the outcome is identical. In the winter of 1901, the entire uncensored private record of the 19th century's defining reign passed into the hands of a 43-year-old widow with no fortune, no household of her own, no husband, and no other occupation whatsoever. She had been given the only thing in that family that was truly hers. And there was one more feature of the arrangement that nobody seems to have thought through at the time. The instruction gave her a reason to keep going. A woman in that position, in 1901, had very little in front of her. Her husband was 5 years dead. Her mother, who had been her employer and her entire social world, was gone. Her children were growing. Her brother was king and had no use for her. In the ordinary course of things, she would have become one of those elderly royal relations who open bazaars and appear in the background of group photographs and slowly stop being invited. Instead, she had the largest editorial task in British history sitting on a table in front of her, and it would take her until she was an old woman. And she began the following year. Chapter 9. Within a year, the house was gone too. Her mother's will said Osborne must stay in the family, and her brother gave it away on his coronation day. Victoria's wishes about the house were explicit. Osborne was to remain in the family. She had bought it with her own money, precisely so that it would be theirs and nobody else's, and she left instructions to match. Her children did not want it. Edward VII disliked the place. He had spent his childhood there under a regime of improving lessons and vegetable gardens, and he had no use at all for a large Italianate house on an island off the Hampshire coast when he had Sandringham. None of the others could face the cost of maintaining it. Something between 15 and 70 staff, depending on the season. An estate that had run to more than 2,000 acres by 1864. A house of 4 blocks around 2 courtyards, built in 3 phases across a generation, with an entire wing added in the last decade of the reign. So the new king decided to give it to the nation. It was not straightforward. The estate had been left entailed to his heirs, which meant he could not simply hand it over, and Parliament had to pass the Osborne Estate Act of 1902 to break the entail and let the transfer happen. That is the price of private property. It had taken the privy purse to buy it, and it took an Act of Parliament to give it away. He made the gift on the 9th of August, 1902, his coronation day. Beatrice fought it, and so did her sister Louise. They lost. The 2 daughters who had actually loved the place were outvoted by a brother who had the crown and an argument about money, and the house their father designed went out of the family within 19 months of their mother's death. There was compensation, of a kind. Both sisters were granted houses on the estate. Beatrice had been living at Osborne Cottage since Henry's death in 1896, and the king extended her grounds. It was a decent gesture, and it was also a settlement. The sort of thing offered to somebody who has lost an argument and needs to be seen to have got something. Then came the part that must have been hardest to watch. The private apartments on the upper floors of the pavilion, including the bedroom in which Victoria had died in January 1901, were sealed on the king's orders. They became a private museum accessible to the family alone. The bed, the pillow, Albert's portrait resting on it, the watch bag hanging above, all of it locked away behind a door that the public would not pass through for another 53 years. And the rest of the house went to work. Naval reforms in 1902 demanded a rapid expansion in officer training. Building started in March 1903, and Edward VII formally opened the Royal Naval College at Osborne that August. Boys arrived at around 13 years old and trained for 2 years before going on to Dartmouth. Among them, in due course, were 2 of the king's own grandsons, who would each become king themselves, and their brother. Among them, too, was Jack Llewellyn Davies, one of the boys who had inspired Peter Pan, and George Archer Shee, whose wrongful expulsion over a stolen postal order worth 5 shillings became the case behind the Winslow boy. The college ran until the 9th of April 1921, when the last students left. Other parts of the house became a convalescent home for officers named for the king. Robert Graves recovered there. So did A. Milne. It went on taking retired officers of the services until the year 2000. Part of the ground floor was open to the public in 1904. So within 3 years of Victoria's death, Osborne House had been given to the nation by Act of Parliament, filled with 13-year-old naval cadets, opened to paying visitors on the ground floor, and sealed shut on the floor above where her body had lain. The private paradise that had been built specifically so that no official could interfere with it had become, in every practical sense, a government institution. And Beatrice watched all of it from a cottage at the end of the grounds where she had begun, in that same year of 1902, to work through her mother's journals. Think about the timing of that, because the 2 things are not separate. She lost the house her father built, and the room her mother died in, and the ground her children had played on, all in the space of a few months, to a brother who had never wanted them. She could do nothing about any of it. Every decision belonged to somebody else, except one. In a cottage a few hundred yards from a house that no longer belonged to her family, one woman held the only thing that had not been taken, and she alone would decide what happened to it. She sold Osborne Cottage in 1913 and moved into Carisbrooke Castle, the governor's residence that came with the office her husband had left her, where the previous occupant had just died. She adapted the hall range and the constable's lodging, put in a bathroom, and made it her summer home. Her personal standard flew from the keep when she was there. She kept the arrangement for 25 years. The old southeast range was fitted up for her staff, with a tunnel driven through to connect it to her own apartments, which is a very Victorian solution to the problem of servants existing. There is a grim wit in where she ended up. Carisbrooke was where Charles I was held. He came to the Isle of Wight in November 1647 after slipping out of house arrest at Hampton Court, expecting sanctuary from the governor and finding a jailer instead. He was kept there with a certain amount of ceremony, attended by his own household, with a bowling green laid out for him on the east side. On the 20th of March, 1648, he tried to get out through a window on a silk cord and stuck fast between an iron bar and the frame. On the 29th of May, he tried again with a rope, having bribed his guards, who took the money and reported him. In September, he was moved to Newport, and from there by stages to Whitehall and the Block on the 30th of January 1649. His daughter Elizabeth died inside the castle in 1650, at 14. So the house Princess Beatrice moved into, to complete the destruction of a monarch's private record, was the house where a monarch had been held, watched, and finally taken away to be killed. She lived in it for a quarter of a century. In a walled garden she made her own, above the room where a king had failed twice to climb out of a window, and the boxes went with her. Chapter 10. Read it, copy it, then burn it. The volumes arrived one at a time from the king's librarian, which means somebody official was feeding the fire. The method was simple, and it was the simplicity that made it so complete. A volume of Queen Victoria's journal would come to Beatrice from the Royal Library. She would read it. She would make a working draft of the version she intended to keep, cutting and altering as she judged fit. Then she would copy that draft out, in her own handwriting, into a blue-bound notebook supplied by the court stationers Parkins and Gotto. Then she would destroy the original volume. And she would destroy her own working draft as well, so that no intermediate stage survived either. And she would send for the next one. She did that, over and over, for 29 years. Notice the detail about the librarian, because it changes the whole character of what happened. This was not a woman burning her mother's diaries in secret. The volumes were being issued to her, one at a time, by the royal household's own officers. The machinery of the institution was handing her the books. Whatever this was, it was sanctioned. The one direct trace of the work in progress comes from a letter Beatrice wrote to Lord Esher in 1904, 3 years in. "Could you call on me at Kensington?" she asked. "I would give you the key of the box so that you could get some volumes of the journals out for me. Having finished the last book I had for writing into, read that as an ordinary piece of office correspondence, which is what it is, and it is chilling. She has run out of notebooks. She needs the next batch of originals. Would he please come and collect the key of the box, the same box, or its descendant, that had travelled with her mother between Windsor and Balmoral and Osborne for half a century, holding the only unguarded thing the woman ever produced. Picture the physical labour of it, because that is the part the phrase 30 years hides. This was not editing in any sense a publisher would recognise. There was no typewriter involved and no assistant. A woman in her 40s, then her 50s, then her 60s, sitting at a table with an open volume in front of her, reading a full day's entry, deciding, writing out a version, then writing that version again into a clean book, in ink, by hand, in a script neat enough to be read by strangers in 100 years. Twice. Every page. For nearly 3 decades. And her hands were failing her by the end of it. The rheumatism that would eventually put her in a wheelchair already at work in the joints. She worked at Osborne Cottage until 1913 and at Carisbrooke Castle after that. The sources establish the residence dates and the working dates independently, and they overlap, so the honest way to put it is this. She carried the work with her from the cottage to the castle. What cannot be said, because nobody wrote it down, is which volumes went into which fire. That distinction matters more than any other in this story, so it is worth being exact about what is actually known. Nobody witnessed the burning. There is no eyewitness account, no servant's memoir, no diary entry by a relative describing the smell of smoke in a room at Carisbrooke. What is documented is this. The original volumes covering the years after 1840 do not exist in the Royal Archives today. Multiple sources state plainly that she burned each original once she had transcribed it. The volumes were being supplied to her one at a time by the librarian and were never seen again. That is a proof by absence, and it is as solid a proof as absence can give. But it means that everything anybody says about the contents of those volumes is inference. Nobody alive has read them. Nobody alive can say what any particular lost page contained. She finished in 1931. Here is what she had produced. 111 volumes in her own handwriting. One detailed count records 68 in blue cloth, 42 in brown and gold leather, and 1 bound in suede, though that breakdown is less securely established than the headline figure. The finished text runs to roughly 1/3 of the length of the original. The final entry, for the 13th of January 1901, stands in Beatrice's hand, in red ink. In red ink, in the daughter's writing, is the last thing Queen Victoria ever recorded. Set the numbers side by side, and the scale becomes clear. 69 years of daily writing, from the 1st of August 1832 to the 13th of January 1901. Between 2,000 and 2,500 words a day. Something near 60 million words across the journals and letters together. Something in the order of 122 volumes in the original run, depending on how the counting is done, reduced to 111 at 1/3 the length. 13 original volumes surviving in Victoria's own hand, covering 1832 to the beginning of 1837. 29 years of copying, by one woman, by hand, finishing when she was in her 70s. The obvious question is why she did not simply seal them. It was available to her. Sealing private papers for a term of years was ordinary practice for documents of this importance. She could have locked the originals away for 50 years, or 100, and left the judgment to somebody who was not the daughter of the woman who wrote them. The Royal Archives had just been established under a professional keeper for precisely this kind of problem. The option existed, and she did not take it. She burned them instead, which is a decision with no way back in it. A seal can be broken by a later generation. A fire cannot be argued with. Perhaps that was the point. A seal leaves the question open, and an open question in a family like that one is a wound that stays wet for a century. Beatrice closed it. There is a harder possibility, and the honest thing is to name it and leave it standing, because there is no document that settles it either way. For 40 years, this woman had been told what she could want, whom she could marry, where she could live, and when she could speak. She had been handed a title for her husband, rooms in her mother's house, a job with no name and no salary. She had never in her life held a decision that was entirely her own, and then she was handed one. whatever else those 29 years were, they were the first thing Beatrice ever did that nobody could take away from her. By 1931, everything the Queen had written after 1840 existed only in her daughter's version of it, which raises the question that the rest of this story has to answer. If nobody ever read the originals, how does anybody know what she took out? Chapter 11. One February morning proves everything. 3 days after her wedding, Victoria wrote down what a new husband does on an ordinary morning, and it did not survive. The answer to that question is an accident, and the accident has a name. Reginald Brett, 2nd Viscount Esher, was appointed by Edward VII as the first keeper of the royal archives shortly after Victoria's death. The royal papers had never been a professional archive before. They had been a heap of boxes in the care of whoever happened to be trusted. Esher was the man brought in to turn them into an institution. He was also a writer, and he wanted a book. The book he wanted was about the young Victoria, the girl before Albert and the woman in the first weeks of her marriage. It came out in 1912 as The Girlhood of Queen Victoria. To write it, he needed the early journals, and to work from them conveniently, he had typescript copies made of the original manuscript volumes covering 1832 through to the 16th of February 1840, which is 6 days after the wedding. He made those copies before those originals went into the fire. Nothing about that was an act of preservation. Esher was not standing guard over the record, and no source suggests he tried to stop what Beatrice was doing with the later volumes. He wanted material for his own book, and he had it typed up, because that was easier than working from the manuscripts. The result is that for a window of about 8 years, and 8 years only, the unedited words of Queen Victoria and Princess Beatrice's version of those same words both exist. 2 accounts of the same days, one of them the real thing, one of them the survivor. They can be laid side by side, and when they are, the whole method comes into view in a single morning. The date is the 13th of February, 1840. Victoria has been married to Albert for 3 days. This is what she actually wrote, preserved in Esher's typescript. Got up at 20 minutes to 9. My dearest Albert put on my stockings for me. I went in and saw him shave, a great delight for me. We breakfasted at 9:30 together, wrote to Lord Melbourne in Albert's room, sang to him, dressed, and so on. I passed through the middle room where Lord Melbourne was with Albert, wrote my journal. Albert and I went to see Mama at 20 minutes to 1. Albert, my dearest Albert, drove me out in the pony carriage, the ladies following in carriages and the gentlemen on horseback. We met Papa driving the Duchess of Sutherland. We met the hounds coming home, Ernest in a red coat and top boots, and in high spirits at the hunt. It was a lovely day. We came home at 10 minutes past 2. At 2:30, we all lunched in the Oak Room. Mamma came to our rooms, and then Ernest came and stayed with us. At 5 minutes past 4, Lord Melbourne came to me and stayed with me till 5 minutes to 5. He was not very well. Talked of our having driven out, there being bad news from China. Now here is the same day in Princess Beatrice's hand, in the version that survives in the royal archives. We went to see Mama after breakfast, and I wrote my journal. Before 1, dearest Albert drove me out in the pony phaeton, the ladies following in carriages and the gentlemen on horseback. We met Papa, driving the Duchess of Sutherland, and the hounds coming back, Ernest in a red coat and top boots, in high spirits at the hunt. It was a lovely day. We all lunched in the Oak Rooms. Mamma afterwards came to our rooms, and then Ernest came and stayed with us. Saw Lord Melbourne before 4, who stayed with me nearly an hour. Talked of there being bad news from China. The entire morning is gone, waking at 20 minutes to 9. her husband kneeling to put her stockings on for her, going in to watch him shave, and writing down that it was a great delight. Breakfast together at 9:30. Writing to Lord Melbourne in Albert's room, singing to him, getting dressed, walking through the middle room and finding the Prime Minister with her husband. All of it gone. The surviving version begins in the middle of the morning with a walk to see Mamma. What was removed was a young woman's account of the first ordinary intimate hours of her marriage. What was left was the weather and the hunt, and it was not scandal. There is nothing in that passage a modern reader would call improper. A man puts his wife's stockings on. She watches him shave and enjoys it. They eat breakfast. That is the whole offence. It was cut because it was warm and physical and human, and because a daughter reading it 40 years later decided that the Queen Empress of India should not be seen kneeling in a bedroom with her stockings in a young man's hands. This comparison is not a curiosity dug up by one enthusiast. It is cited by Michael Nelson, by Lucy Worsley, by A.N. Wilson, and by Cynthia Gannett. It is the standard scholarly exhibit, the single agreed piece of physical evidence for what the editing did, and every historian working on Victoria knows it. And it covers one day in 1840. That is the vertigo at the centre of this story. If that is what came out of a harmless Thursday in the first week of a marriage, the mind runs immediately to the 61 years that followed and to everything in them. The death of Albert, the decades of grief, the fights with her sons, her opinions of her daughters, her ministers, in private, unguarded, John Brown, Abdul Karim, the whole long second half of the reign. And here the discipline has to come down hard, because that is exactly the point where speculation starts dressing itself up as history. Nobody knows. There is no evidence about the contents of a single destroyed page. What historians can say, and what they do say, is what was cut as a class from the sample that survives, and then reason cautiously outward. The consensus inference is that Beatrice removed physical and sexual intimacy with Albert, family quarrels, Victoria's blunter opinions of her own children, references to John Brown, and political indiscretion about ministers and foreign royalty. That is an inference drawn from one surviving window and from the categories Victoria was known to write about. It is not a description of anything anybody has read. The honest summary is uncomfortable, and it is the only summary available. There is exactly one photograph of the crime. It was taken by a man who was not trying to take it, and it shows 8 years out of 69. Everything else is a locked room with the door welded shut. And while Beatrice was working through those volumes in a cottage on the Isle of Wight, her eldest brother was going through the rest of their mother's papers with a very different method and a great deal less patience. Chapter 12. Her brother was burning things too. While she copied in her notebooks, the new king was sending men to other people's houses to collect the letters. Edward VII had waited 59 years to be king, and one of the first things he did with the office was tidy up his mother's private life. The first target was John Brown. Brown had been Victoria's Highland servant and her closest companion for nearly 20 years, and the family had loathed him. He had managed her excursions from 1864. He had unrestricted access to her bedroom when she was ill. When he died in 1883, she commissioned a life-sized statue of him from Edgar Boom and had it inscribed, "Friend, more than servant, loyal, truthful, brave, selfless than duty, even to the grave." On his accession, Edward had that statue moved somewhere less conspicuous. The private memorials his mother had put up to Brown were destroyed on his orders. A commemorative cairn at Balmoral was taken down. Then came the letters. In 1905, Sir James Reed, the royal physician, dealt with a blackmailer. The material at issue was more than 300 letters from Queen Victoria to Alexander Prophet, her factor at Balmoral, concerning John Brown. Reed handled it. The letters came into royal hands, and Edward VII destroyed them. Reed's own diary is reported to have described them as most compromising. That phrase has done a great deal of work in the century since, and it deserves to be handled carefully. The letters no longer exist. Nobody now living has read them. Most compromising is a characterization that reaches the present through Reed's family, describing documents that cannot be checked. It is a report of a judgment, not a description of contents. And on the larger question underneath it, the position of the evidence is clear and should be stated plainly rather than hinted at. There is no evidence that Victoria and John Brown were lovers. The claims of a secret marriage and the claims of a child are legend. They rest on hearsay, passed through several hands, and no document supports them. A queen grieved for a friend, ferociously and publicly, and her family found it humiliating. That much is certain, and it is quite enough of a story on its own. There is one more Brown episode, and it belongs here, though it is an anecdote rather than a documented sequence. Victoria drafted a private memoir of Brown, intended for circulation. Randall Davidson, then Dean of Windsor and later Archbishop of Canterbury, read it and advised strongly against publication. She was furious. Davidson offered his resignation. According to the son of her private secretary Henry Ponsonby, the manuscript was quietly destroyed. The details of that account come down through household memory rather than through paperwork, and it should be held loosely. The second target was Abdul Karim. Karim had come into the household in 1887 and served the Queen until her death. He taught her Urdu and Indian custom, and Munshi, the name she used for him, means teacher. He was housed at Frogmore Cottage at Windsor and at Arthur Cottage at Osborne, which still stands on the corner of York Avenue outside the visitor gates. More Indian servants had been brought in so that Karim would not have to do menial work, and the resentment that caused ran through the entire household and the whole family. After Victoria died, Edward VII sent men to Karim's cottage at Windsor and demanded every letter and paper connected with the Queen. They took them and burned them on the spot. Karim and the other Indian servants were ordered out of England and back to India. He lived his remaining years near Agra and died in 1909. Some letters were later returned to his heirs because the colonial government in India disapproved of how the seizure had been handled. His own diary survived, hidden. His family kept it secret for more than a century, and it surfaced in 2010 when the author Shrabani Basu was handed it by Begum Kamar Jahan, then 85 years old and blind, a descendant through Karim's nephew. It is a neat brown journal with gold edges written on the stationery used at Windsor. Now put the three operations next to each other. Between 1901 and 1931, the letters of Queen Victoria to her Balmoral factor were destroyed by her son. The papers of the man who taught her Urdu were burned in his own house by her son's men. Her memorials to her closest companion were pulled down by her son, and the entire manuscript of her private journal after 1840 was copied and burned by her daughter. 4 separate acts, 2 children, 30 years, 1 direction of travel, and there was a 5th operation running alongside them, conducted in daylight and considered entirely respectable. Lord Esher, with the schoolmaster and author Arthur Benson, was editing the Letters of Queen Victoria for the publisher John Murray, a project that began in 1907 and ran on into the 1930s. That was the authorised Public Victoria, assembled by 2 men from the correspondence that survived. The historian Yvonne Ward one of very few people ever given access to the royal archives for this purpose, has argued that the Victoria the world inherited was shaped as much by that selection as by any fire. What went missing from the published letters in her account was Victoria's experience of motherhood, her struggle to hold together the roles of ruler and wife, and her close friendships with other royal women. Ward's argument is that posterity is left with what was used instead of what was taken out, which means the same material was being filtered twice over, by a daughter in a cottage and by two gentlemen in an office, and neither filter was interested in the parts of Victoria that were female. This was a family policy, carried out by people who believed they were being loyal. Not one of them thought of it as vandalism. Edward believed he was protecting his mother's dignity, which he had found unbearable while she was alive. Beatrice believed she was carrying out written instructions from a woman she had loved and served for 43 years. Between them, they removed almost everything that would have let anybody see the woman rather than the monument. And Beatrice, unlike her brother, was not finished. She had another 26 years of it in front of her, and the world outside her window was about to take her sons. Chapter 13. What she lost while she was copying. She was writing out her mother's account of a vanished Europe at the exact moment that Europe was killing her sons. The work ran from 1902 to 1931, and those 29 years happened to be the years in which the world Victoria had described was demolished. On the 27th of October 1914, Prince Maurice of Battenberg was killed in action at the First Battle of Ypres. He was 23, the youngest of Beatrice's 4 children, and by every account, her favourite. She had been at the desk for 12 years when the telegram came. She had another 17 to go. She commissioned the altar painting in the chapel at Carisbrooke in his memory. St. Nicholas Chapel became the island's war memorial, commemorating 2,000 island men, with woodwork in it taken from a decommissioned wooden warship. She was governor of the Isle of Wight, so the memorial to the island's dead and the memorial to her own son were the same building. 3 years later, the family changed its name. In 1917, with anti-German feeling at its height and a war being fought against her husband's country of birth, George V reconstructed the House of Windsor and the German titles went. Beatrice and her children renounced theirs. Her sons became Mountbattens. Alexander was later created Marquess of Carisbrooke, and Beatrice, who had been Princess Henry of Battenberg for 32 years, reverted to Her Royal Highness the Princess Beatrice. Sit with the shape of that. She was spending her days copying out her mother's descriptions of a Europe of interconnected German princes, cousins, and serene highnesses, and small courts at Darmstadt and Coburg, while upstairs the family scrubbed the German out of its own name, and her son lay in the ground in Flanders. She was performing on a page precisely what her nephew the king was performing on a nation. In 1922, she lost another son. Leopold had been born a haemophiliac, having inherited the condition through his mother, and he died after an emergency knee operation at Kensington Palace, 1 month short of his 33rd birthday. The same inheritance had already reached Spain. Her daughter Victoria Eugenie, called Ina, had married King Alfonso XIII on the 31st of May, 1906, on a wedding day marked by an anarchist bomb. Their heir proved to be haemophiliac. Alfonso blamed Beatrice personally for carrying the condition into the Spanish royal house, and the marriage never recovered from it. 2 of Ina's sons died of complications of the disease after car accidents. By the middle of the 1920s, Beatrice was a woman in her late 60s who had buried her husband, 2 of her 4 children, and both her parents, who had been blamed by a king for the blood in his sons, and who had lost the house she grew up in to her brother. Her hands were increasingly crippled by rheumatism. In time, she needed a wheelchair. And every year, in a castle on the Isle of Wight, she went on copying out her mother's handwriting into blue notebooks. Nobody made her continue. There was no deadline and no supervisor. George V, who is documented as having deplored the destruction along with Queen Mary, was on the throne and did not stop her. No quotation from either of them objecting has ever surfaced, and no record explains why two monarchs who disliked what was happening let it go on for 3 decades. What is documented is that they opposed it and that it continued anyway, which raises a question with no comfortable answer. What was she still protecting 25 years after the woman had died? The people who might have been hurt by the contents were dying off one by one. Her brothers were gone. The generation whose quarrels filled those pages was mostly in the ground. By 1931, the sensitivities that had justified the whole exercise had largely ceased to exist. She finished anyway. She had been given a task, and she completed it. And she was in her 70s when the last volume went. Something in that persistence deserves to be looked at without judgment. This was a woman who had been told what she could want since she was 4 years old, and who had complied every single time. And the compliance had cost her almost everything a person can be asked to give. She had obeyed about the suitors. She had obeyed about the terms of her marriage. She had obeyed about where she lived and when she travelled, and what her husband was permitted to do with his life. And then the last instruction arrived, from beyond the grave, and she obeyed that one too, for 29 years, long after anybody was left who cared whether she did. Loyalty that outlasts its own purpose stops being loyalty at some point and turns into something closer to identity. By the 1920s, carrying out her mother's wishes was not a duty Beatrice performed. It was the only version of herself she had ever been allowed to build. She used Carisbrooke as her summer home until 1938, her standard flying from the keep. Her last years were spent at Brantridge Park in West Sussex, the house of her niece, Princess Alice, and the Earl of Athlone, who were then in Canada. She died in her sleep there on the 26th of October, 1944, aged 87. It was 1 day short of the 30th anniversary of Maurice's death at Ypres. She was the last surviving child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Her funeral was at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 3rd of November, 1944. The Queen led Victoria Eugenie of Spain to the vault. Standing in the choir stalls in black was an 18-year-old girl called Princess Elizabeth, who would one day be queen. Beatrice did not stay at Windsor. In late August 1945, her coffin was taken to St. Mildred's Church at Whippingham and laid beside Henry in the Battenberg Chapel, in a private service attended only by her son, the Marquess of Carisbrooke, and his wife. She was laid on the island, next to the man she had waited for at Madeira. Her son was buried in the same chapel in July 1961. What she left behind was 111 volumes, a museum, a war memorial, and a reputation that has never recovered. Chapter 14. The Queen nobody will ever read. Every biography of Queen Victoria ever written rests on a text that somebody else decided you were allowed to read. Here is the inventory of what survives. 13 original volumes in Victoria's own handwriting, covering 1832 to the beginning of 1837, spared because Beatrice's remit concerned the reign rather than the girlhood. One account holds that the last of those volumes originally ran on into the early months of 1837, and that Beatrice removed and destroyed those particular pages after transcribing them, which, if correct, is the one recorded instance of her cutting into a book that still exists. Lord Isha's 13 typescript volumes, covering 1832 to the 16th of February 1840, made for a book he wanted to write. 4 volumes of Victoria's own drafts, with a date range the sources give loosely, and 111 volumes in the handwriting of Princess Beatrice, at roughly a third the length of what they replaced, ending with that entry of the 13th of January 1901 in red ink. That is the entire surviving record of the most documented life of the 19th century. In 2012, the Royal Archives, the Bodleian Libraries at Oxford, and the publisher ProQuest put all of it online. On the 24th of May, Victoria's birthday, timed to the Diamond Jubilee of Elizabeth II, 141 volumes and 43,765 pages were digitized and made searchable. Isha's copies and Beatrice's copies alongside each other, so that anybody could do the comparison for themselves. For about a year, it was free to the whole world. Since the middle of 2013, free access has been restricted to users inside the United Kingdom. So the last turn of this story is that a person in Melbourne or Toronto who wants to read the private thoughts of the woman who ruled over their grandparents must now pay for the privilege, or be refused. The door was opened for 13 months and then pulled most of the way shut again. Even now, somebody decides who reads the Queen. The historian Julia Baird has described what Beatrice did as one of the greatest acts of historical censorship of the century. That is a hard verdict, and there is a serious case against it, made by careful people. A.N. Wilson has argued that the destruction does not demand a single interpretation, and that a cover-up of scandal is not the only explanation available. Victoria expressed herself so forcefully and so freely and so often that the sheer volume and rawness of the writing may be reason enough for a daughter to have pruned it. And the defense that matters most is the simplest one. Beatrice did not decide to do this. Her mother told her to, in writing, and she obeyed, as she had obeyed that woman in every particular for 43 years. Both things are true. She was following orders, and the orders destroyed the record, and the person who gave them is beyond reach. But something else needs saying, and it is the thing this story has been circling from the first minute. Beatrice was the least powerful person in that entire family. No throne, no fortune, no roof that was not somebody else's until she was widowed. No permission to marry, then permission granted on terms that made a marriage into a lodging arrangement. She was told at 6 what her life would be, and she was held to it. Her own function, for 4 decades, was to be present and to require nothing. And it was into her hands, and nobody else's, that the whole memory of the reign was placed. She did not take that power. It was given to her by the woman who had spent 40 years making certain she had none. She was given the key of the box because she was the one who would never run. Every popular idea of Queen Victoria comes down through her. Every biography, every drama, every argument about who that woman really was, is built on a text in a daughter's handwriting, edited by a daughter's judgment, at a desk on an island, over 29 years. There is no unmediated Victoria after 1840. There is only Beatrice's Victoria. And that is the last thing this story leaves behind, which is the thing this channel keeps finding wherever it looks. Osborne House was built by a prince with private money in a style meant to outlast him, and it was given away within 19 months of its owner's death. The journals were kept obsessively for 69 years by a woman who plainly believed she was writing for posterity, and they were fed to the fire volume by her favourite child. Nothing here was taken by an enemy. There was no revolution, no invasion, no bailiff at the door, no fire that anybody failed to put out. Every single thing in this story was destroyed by the people who loved it most, acting on what they sincerely believed was devotion. The danger to a great inheritance almost never comes over the wall. It is already inside the house, holding a private letter of instruction that nobody else has read. There are 111 volumes in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle containing the private journal of Queen Victoria, and every word of them is in her daughter's handwriting. If you got something out of this one, subscribe, because this channel goes after the stories that were tidied away rather than the ones that were kept. And I keep going back and forth on this, so tell me where you land. Was Beatrice a loyal daughter carrying out her mother's last wish? Or did she steal Queen Victoria from all of us?